So in the last segment, we discussed why a realist modal ontology is preferable to a mentalist modal ontology. In this segment, we're going to, and again, the reason is because if we lose a realist modal ontology, we lose realism about persistence conditions for individuals and realism about individuation conditions for kinds. And both of those things are bad because it means that what exists, what kinds of things exists, which individuals exist, becomes up to us. And that seems implausible. So with that in mind, we're going to return to the dilemma, and now you can see it really is a dilemma. We really do want a realist modal ontology, which makes the empiricist approach to modality undesirable. But as we've emphasized already, a realist modal ontology seems to be a poor fit with the standard epistemology for modality. That is, reflecting on our concepts, reflecting on the meanings of our expressions, having intuitions about possibility and necessity that are based on our possession of our concepts and our understanding of our words seems like a bad way to learn about mind-independent reality. So in response to this puzzle, Kant makes a proposal. So Kant suggests that we are stuck with an intuition-based modal epistemology. He thinks that's the only game in town. But he suggests that if we adopt a constructivist modal ontology, we can get the sort of what we want from realism, but we can also get a good fit with our intuition-based modal epistemology. So what is this constructivist modal ontology? Well, I'm not going to dive too deep into Kant's picture here. There's a famous work by Kant called The Critique of Pure Reason, which is rather difficult to read, in which he sets out the picture. But here's the basic idea. He thinks that things in themselves, what he calls noumena, things in themselves, are unknowable to us. We can know they're out there, or at least present a sort of transcendental argument for their existence. So we can say, I'll set that aside. We can know they're out there, let's say. We can know that there is some sort of mind-independent reality, but we can't say anything specific about it. Instead, the world to which we refer, the world that we can think and talk about, the world that's populated by things like people and desks and you and me, that world is sort of the result, this is not exactly the best way to put it, but it's the easiest way to understand, is the result of a kind of interaction between our minds and that mind-independent reality about which we can't say anything. So you can think of reality as having sort of three stages. There's the mind, there's the things in themselves, the noumena, about which we know nothing other than that there's something or other out there. And there's this world that exists independent of any particular mind, but that's kind of created collectively by our minds interacting with the mind-independent reality, with the noumena. And that's called the phenomenal world, or sometimes called the empirical world. It's the world that we think of. It's the world that our concepts and our terms refer to. It's the world of people and places and things. So I exist, according to Kant. I really do exist. And it's not an idealism. I don't exist just as an idea in people's minds. Rather, I exist as a sort of interaction between minds and mind-independent reality. I exist in this phenomenal world, this empirical world, which again, it's not an idealist world. It's not just comprised of how people think, but it's comprised of both how people think and what mind-independent reality, which is unknowable other than its existence, is like. So a constructivist modal ontology holds that the truth makers for modal claims are in this kind of empirical or phenomenal world. And then Kant's idea is this, that we get the advantage of realism because which individuals and kinds there are, and of course, because of what modal properties there are, isn't up to us. So we get the advantage of realism because it's not just up to us. But we also get the advantage of mentalism because since we are partly constituting, that is, since our minds, our concepts are partly constituting this world, it makes sense that reflecting on our concepts can tell us about this world. So here's some passages from Kant in which he pushes this line. He says, up to now it has been assumed by the rationalists and the empiricists that all our cognition must conform to objects. That's the idea that there's a mind-independent reality, and insofar as we know about it, it's because our minds are conforming to that reality. But, says Kant, all attempts to find out something about that mind-independent reality, those objects, a priori, through concepts that would extend our cognition, have, on this presupposition, come to nothing. So his claim here is, we've been assuming that we talk and refer to and think about a mind-independent reality, but we want to say we can have a priori knowledge of it, that our intuition can be a guide to it. But that doesn't work. When he says it has come to nothing, what he's saying is we haven't addressed this challenge of making our epistemology fit with our ontology, our a prioristic epistemology fit with our realist ontology. So he's expressing this same puzzle that we've been talking about. And here's his proposed solution. He says, hence, let us try whether we do not get further. So he's saying, let's try and advance the problem here. With these problems, the problems of metaphysics, of necessity and possibility, see if we can get further by assuming that the objects must conform to our cognition. Now notice he's not saying that our cognition creates the objects. That would be idealism. That would be Berkeley. He's not saying our cognition creates the objects. He's saying the objects conform to our cognition. So how do they conform to our cognition? Well, there's a mind-independent reality, but it's not the world we think and talk about. But when we think and talk, we're sort of interacting with it and thereby creating this empirical world, this phenomenal world, which conforms to our cognition because it's created partly by our cognition, by the categories that we use to think. And he says that fits better the idea that we can have a priori justification for beliefs about it. Since our concepts are partly constituting this reality, it makes sense that reflecting on our concepts can reveal the reality to us. Okay. And then he thinks that his proposal here is incredibly radical. So he's describing how radical it is now. He says, this view would be just like the first thoughts of Copernicus, who, when he didn't make good progress in the explanation of the celestial motions, if he assumed that the entire celestial host revolves around the observer, tried to see if he might not have greater success if he made the observer revolve and left the stars at rest. So the idea is, just like Copernicus had to have a sort of paradigm shift, he had to say, look, I can't explain the celestial motion if I assume that I'm still and the stars are moving, but I can if I assume that I'm moving and the stars are still. Similarly, if we assume that the world and we think and talk about is entirely independent of us, we can't make progress. But if we assume it's partly constituted by us, we can. So that's Kant's proposal. So Kant makes his sort of what's called the Copernican revolution precisely to his version of the Copernican revolution, precisely to solve the challenge that we've been exploring. And he thinks you get a good fit here and a good ontology, so everybody's happy. But I think not so fast. Why? Well, let's suppose the fit really is good. Okay, so suppose that Kant does satisfy this desideratum that we should have our epistemology fit well with our ontology. Well, the fit is good only insofar as modal properties are bestowed by us, only insofar as our minds are imposing modality on the world. So the fit is good only insofar as modality is just mind-dependent, making which individuals there are mind-dependent, making which kinds there are mind-dependent. But if that's right, then the ontology is no good. The ontology is as bad as a mentalist ontology. So if the fit is good, then the ontology isn't. Well, let's suppose instead that the ontology is desirably realist. Necessity isn't imposed by the mind. Now we face the problem of fit all over again. Why is the fit any better if we have a realist modal ontology here? That is, we're right back where we started. So I don't think Kant's proposal actually gets us very far. He's trying to sort of walk a middle ground that can't be walked. Okay. So the point is, Kant's approach has either the disadvantage of empiricism, an undesirable ontology, or the disadvantage of rationalism, a poor fit between the ontology and the epistemology. Okay, one thing I want you to notice is that all of these approaches have intuition as a common factor. They all think that they all have basically the same modal epistemology. Okay, so let's press on by considering Quine. Quine is also an empiricist, but he's a different sort of empiricist. He replaces the intuition-based modal epistemology with no modal epistemology at all. And he replaces the mentalist modal ontology with no modal ontology at all, saying that there are no modal truths. Now, notice that the same reasons to be a realist rather than a mentalist are reasons to be a realist rather than a nihilist. We talked about that specifically in the last segment. So I don't think Quine's picture here is promising because he has an undesirable modal ontology, one that leaves which kinds there are and which individuals there are up to us. But let's set that aside and just look at Quine's position here so we can understand it better. So here's a passage from Quine. He says, "We can at least limit modalities to whole statements. We may impose the adverb possibly upon a statement as a whole, and we may well worry about the semantical analysis of such usage, but little real advance in such analysis is to be hoped for in expanding our universe to include so-called possible entities." So what's going on here? There's a famous distinction between de re and de dicto modal statements. A de dicto modal statement applies the possibly adverb to the statement as a whole. You could say, possibly, my daughter is a frog. The de re reading applies the modality to the individual itself. So you might say, my daughter is possibly a frog. So the idea is, on the first reading, when you say possibly my daughter is a frog, you're saying the statement my daughter is a frog is possibly true. So you're saying the statement has the property of being possible or not. You're not saying anything about the individual having a property of one sort or another. You're just saying the statement has the property. Whereas if you apply it, you do the de re reading and you say, my daughter is possibly a frog, then you're saying my daughter has a certain property, the property of being possibly a frog. Quine here is saying, let's limit necessity and possibility talk to statements as a whole and not apply necessity and possibility talk to individuals. We can talk about why he thinks that is if people have questions. I'm just pointing this out. So now, remember for Quine, something exists only if the best theory quantifies over it. That is, only if the best theory refers to it. Here, Quine claims that we shouldn't quantify over necessities and possibilities. So it follows for Quine that necessities and possibilities don't exist. Now you can see why the de dicto reading is okay for Quine, but the de re isn't. It's because when you have the de re reading, you're putting the necessity and possibilities inside the quantifiers. You're quantifying over them. You're saying that they exist. Whereas when you stick them outside of the sentence, you're not quantifying over them. You're not saying they exist, so it's not as big of a deal. You probably won't come across this, but in case you ever do, when people talk about quantified modal logic, that's when you quantify over the necessities and possibilities. You have de re readings of modal statements. You're saying the necessities and possibilities themselves exist. When they reject quantified modal logic, which Quine explicitly does, they're saying you can only have de dicto modal statements so that you don't end up saying necessities and possibilities really exist. Okay. In a sense, this may all be a cheat because the reasons to be a realist about modality, you might think, are not reasons to think that real necessities and possibilities exist, but rather are reasons to think that some truths are necessary independently of how we think about the world. So maybe Quine is okay because he allows de dicto modal statements, and that's really all we want. So I was talking as if we want de re modality, but maybe we only want de dicto. I don't think that's right, but let's just suppose that for the sake of argument and say maybe Quine can have that since he allows a necessity operator to apply to sentences, since he allows de dicto modal statements. But he actually can't allow these. When he talks about allowing them, he's just trying to draw a contrast with what he thinks is clearly a bad idea, and that's quantified modal logic, that's de re modality. But he doesn't really want to allow de dicto modality in either. And in fact, he can't. And here's why he can't. So Quine advocates empiricism. So he accepts that sensory experience grounds any justified belief about the external world. That's the heart of empiricism. You can't have substantive a priori knowledge. That is, you need perception to give you substantive knowledge of the external world, the world outside your mind. That empiricist dictum leads Hume to conclude that modal claims are made true by relations among ideas. Since clearly the idea goes modal knowledge is a priori knowledge, and a priori knowledge can't be substantive knowledge, can't be knowledge of the mind-independent world. It must be knowledge of relations among ideas. That's Hume's view. But here's the key thing. For Quine, you can't have modal knowledge being knowledge of relations among ideas. Why not? Because for Hume, and I think he's correct about this, if modal knowledge is knowledge of relations among ideas, then one idea must have some sort of deep necessary connection to another. But Quine rejects any such connection. He thinks that concepts are too indeterminate and unstable to ground synonymy, analyticity, a priori, definition, necessary connection, and so on. So we can think of it like this. Quine's like, look, you can't have modality be out there in the world. That would be de re modality. We don't want to quantify over necessity and possibility. So at best, we have de dicto modality. We use necessity and possibility operators on sentences as a whole. Why is that okay? Because it allows us to say modality is just really in the mind. But if necessity is really in the mind, then there must be some necessary connections between concepts. That would mean that some statements are genuinely a priori analytic and so on. And Quine just says that no statements are. So he has to reject de dicto modality too. So as an empiricist, he has to accept that nothing external makes modal claims true or false. And as a dogma-free empiricist, one who rejects analyticity, a priori, and so on, he must accept that nothing mental can ground modal claims either. And that's why he ends up with modal nihilism. Okay. So now let's look at our positions again. We have rationalism with its undesirable fit between its ontology and its epistemology. We have empiricism with its undesirable ontology. And we can now consider how Kripke enters the picture. But I'll save that for a shorter segment next time.